Well, I want to talk this morning about fasting. I'm sure we all know that today is Mother's Day. We might also know that it was originally Mothering Sunday. It's known as Latari Sunday. I think these things have ended up getting merged together because Mothering Sunday was traditionally the day when you would go back to your mother church, the church where you were baptized, and it became a day off in the middle of Lent because it's always the fourth Sunday in Lent, so halfway through, and staff were given that Sunday off to go back home to their families to enjoy a good meal if they were fasting, and so the mother church and actual mothers kind of got conflated, and here we are with Mother's Day, Mothering Sunday. But it was also for that reason, because it was a kind of a day off in the middle of Lent from fasting, it was called Refreshment Sunday as well, as another name for Refreshment Sunday. And what I find extraordinary is the fact that so seriously did Christians collectively take fasting that they needed to have a day off in the middle of Lent. Now, I don't want to embarrass anybody this morning. I'm not going to get us to stick our hands up, but I suspect if I asked you this morning, have you been fasting so seriously that really you could do with a break halfway through Lent? I guess probably not many hands would go up. Even if I asked us, who's even fasting this Lent? And I don't mean, just fasting from social media or trying to eat a bit less chocolate or something like that. As admirable as those things are to do, but I mean actually fasting, like not eating food. Who is doing that? Obviously no hands will go up because Jesus says, don't let anybody know that you're fasting if you are. So obviously we wouldn't stick our hands up. But I would be surprised if that many of us were fasting, because in general, in the church today, fasting it's pretty niche. Not many people really do it. And so how is it that fasting went from being something so integral to Christian discipleship that basically the whole church collectively got together and agreed that it would be a good idea to have a day off in the middle, to the point where now today, nobody does it, but we've still kept the day off and we've repurposed it as a day to celebrate our mums, which is obviously a very good thing to do, but it's not actually anything to do with fasting at all. Is that progress? Or have we lost something possibly in the process, which it might be a good thing for the church to recover? Well, we're in this series in Lent. We're calling it The Celebration of Discipline, because that is the title of this book, which I'm trying hard to persuade people to get hold of a copy and to read. It's by Richard Foster. I think there might still be, we had a few copies for sale if anybody, I think there might be one knocking around somewhere, £9, or you can just get your phone out, put it off aeroplane mode for just a moment while you quickly Amazon yourself a copy. It's a really, really good book to read. It was given to me by my godmother a few years ago. In fact, whilst I was lodging, I've discovered from the date that this was whilst I was lodging with them. And so concerned were they clearly for how ill-disciplined I was that they felt it was important to get me a book about discipline. But what this book has is a chapter on each of what have classically been called the spiritual disciplines or habits or rhythms or practices. We've had a week on each of them. We've had a week on meditation. Celia was preaching to us about the discipline of prayer. Francis last week was speaking to us about the discipline of study. And reading a book's a good thing to do, so get hold of a copy of this book if you want to study. And chapter 4 of this book is the chapter all about fasting. And so that's what we're thinking about this morning, something that most Christians are not practicing, but which is right here in the middle of Jesus' most famous section of teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. So I've got 3 questions for us, just to sort of focus our thoughts this morning. I want to be super practical. 3 questions are these. Should Christians even fast today? Why would anybody fast? And thirdly, how, if we're feeling inspired, which you can tell that I hope we might be by the end of our time together this morning, given especially that there is still half of Lent still to go. If we're thinking about giving it a go, how might we go about doing it? So, should Christians even fast? Why would they fast? And how can we give it a go? First question, should we fast? I think the reason why most of us don't fast is we kind of assume that it's not really necessary. So either that might be because we've sort of packaged it up with being part of like the Old Testament and the Old Testament Jewish religion, which is kind of no longer relevant and applicable to us. So just in the same way that Jesus has fulfilled the temple and the sacrificial system and made them obsolete, isn't it the case that also fasting is packaged up with that, and therefore it's not really relevant for us as New Testament believers? That might be our question. Or we might have such a firm grip on the doctrine of salvation by grace alone, and we're nervous of making it all about the things that we do. We're so grateful for everything that Jesus has done that the idea of fasting can sound a little bit like legalistic, and so we're nervous of it for that reason. And perhaps when we think about times in church history which have taken fasting a lot more seriously than we do today, perhaps we're conscious of the trap that very often people fall into when thinking about spiritual disciplines and practices, of a mindset which says, if I really do this for God, then maybe he'll love me more. If I make it all about what I do, then maybe he'll answer my prayers. He'll let me into heaven because I've been so disciplined. And we're perhaps aware that throughout the history of the church, there have been times when people have taken fasting to kind of an extreme, and they've punished themselves and they've emaciated their bodies in some way of earning spiritual brownie points. And we look at that as people who know that it's not about what we do, it's about what Jesus has done for us. And we go, well, therefore, we don't really need to fast. Well, the fact is that here in Matthew chapter 6, that Jesus, talking to his disciples, which chapter 5, verse 1, start of the Sermon on the Mount, says that's who he's talking to, disciples, in other words, those who are disciplined. Jesus says to them, chapter 6, verse 16, when you fast. And lots of people have been struck by the fact that it doesn't say if you fast, but when. He just assumes that his disciples will fast, just like he assumes that they will give in verse 2, when you give, and verse 5, when you pray. Richard Foster puts it like this in his book, if I can find the page. He says, no, I can't find it. So it's on that page. Yeah, he says this. His teaching on fasting is directly in the context of his teaching on giving and praying. It is as if there is an almost unconscious assumption that giving, praying, and fasting are all part of Christian devotion. We have no more reason to exclude fasting from the teaching than we do giving or praying. So giving, praying, and fasting, they kind of all go together, and Jesus assumes that we are going to fast. In fact, the other place where Jesus talks about fasting is forward a few chapters in chapter 9 of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 9, verse 14. There's a question which comes to Jesus. 9, verse 14, it says Jesus' question about fasting. John's disciples, that is John the Baptist's disciples, came and asked Jesus, how is it that we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples, Jesus, do not fast? They noticed that the disciples weren't fasting with Jesus. Why not? Jesus answered, verse 15, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? So he's saying there's something about fasting which is to do with longing for the arrival of the bridegroom. But he says the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then, says Jesus, they will fast. So he says, carries on Richard Foster, there is no way to escape the force of Jesus' words in this passage. He made it clear that he expected his disciples to fast after he was gone. In the strictest sense, he didn't command us to fast. But it's obviously that he proceeded on the principle that the children of the kingdom of God would fast. For the person longing for a more intimate walk with God, these statements of Jesus are drawing words. That's challenging, isn't it? Jesus expects us to fast. Okay, all right. So, second question, why then? Why? If we've never fasted before and we're thinking, well, why would I? And there's all kinds of reasons why people fast, and not all of them are good. In fact, the primary purpose Jesus has in these 3 short verses in Matthew 6 and the Sermon on the Mount is to address our motivations. Because people fast for all the wrong reasons. In fact, Jesus doesn't want to teach us to fast. He wants us to say that when you do it, don't do it for the wrong motivation. Don't do it to impress other people. Otherwise, that will be all your reward will be. But there are some other motivations, plenty of different reasons why people fast. Perhaps most obviously today, because it's healthy. Did you know that the average first century Jew fasted twice a week? So when Jesus was teaching this, it was totally normal. Do you remember there was a parable that Jesus told of the Pharisee who says, I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all I get? Well, actually, that wasn't like extraordinarily devoted according to first century Jewish practices. That was just typical. That was kind of the standard thing to do, was to tithe a tenth of your income and to fast twice a week. Well, now people have kind of rediscovered that, haven't they? It's called the 5-2 diet. Intermittent fasting. It's sold millions and millions of copies. You eat 5 days a week and then you fast for 2 days a week. And lots of people have discovered that it's a very, very healthy thing for you. We all know that overeating is not good for us. It's not healthy. And interestingly, when the church drew up the list of the 7 deadly sins in the early church, they kind of came up with, here are all the vices which we want to make sure that we avoid. And they distinguished even between different kinds of greed. So they've got greed for money and possessions and stuff and power. That's avarice in the list of the 7 deadly sins. The kind of greed which is the desire to just want to eat more food was its own separate category, gluttony. That makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. But I think we probably all know that it's not healthy to eat too much. Paul wrote in one of his letters, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their God is their stomach. Their God is their stomach. And couldn't that describe many today in our country, which is the most overweight in Europe? Not good. So Christians instead ought to be marked by temperance, self-control. And so partly the point of fasting for a lot of people, whether they're Christians or not, is not to punish the body, but to sort of control it and to subdue it. Martin Luther said, it's right to fast frequently in order to subdue and to control the body. Because there's something about our appetites, which if we give in to them, they get bigger. If we give our appetites whatever they want, they just spiral out of control. And so we've got to get a hold of them. And so fasting is healthy. But although fasting is healthy, that's not the motivation Jesus gives here. It's difficult to think of many biblical examples of fasting for health reasons. Biblical examples of fasting for all kinds of reasons. Fasting generally accompanies prayer in the Bible. Prayer and fasting, as we've said, kind of go together. We think of the book of Acts as they were going out on the mission of the church. There's all kinds of places where they are fasting for discernment, for guidance. Let me just read, don't worry about turning to Acts chapter 13, where it says, Acts 13 verse 2, whilst they were worshipping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart from me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I've called them. So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. Or again in the next chapter, Acts 14, Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they'd put their trust. So there's a sense in which, when it comes to wanting to discern the guidance or direction of the Lord, that prayer and fasting have been part of that process. Have you got a big decision coming up? Is there something major in your life where you feel like, I really want God to give clear guidance? John Calvin said, whenever any difficult matter of great importance is to be discussed, 'tis a holy ordinance and one salutary for all ages that pastors urge the people to fasting and extraordinary prayers. Let me urge you, if you have got something important coming up, fast and pray. Pray for guidance, pray for protection. All kinds of instances in Scripture of prayer and fasting for deliverance from evil. 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Jehoshaphat decreed a national fast when Judah was about to be invaded. Similar in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Esther famously fasted when the Jews were being threatened with extermination. And down throughout church history, leaders who have recognized the sovereign hand of providence in world affairs have urged the people collectively to fast for protection from all manner of calamity which is facing a nation. The Black Death, I think Edward III proclaimed a national day of fasting. The invasion by the Spanish Armada, Napoleon, Hitler, the kings and queens of England, not to mention other countries where examples like this can be multiplied, have exhorted the people of our nation to days of fasting for protection and deliverance from evil. And in many of those cases, in fact, all of those cases I've just mentioned, the Lord dramatically intervened. Many people know about the miracle of Dunkirk, but not many people know that the miracle of Dunkirk happened the day after King George VI decreed a national day of fasting and prayer. And the churches up and down England were filled with people who were joining in with that. In fact, you can see on YouTube, there's the footage of Westminster Abbey of hordes of people queuing who wanted to pray and who were fasting for deliverance. And the Lord gave protection and deliverance from the enemy. Jesus fasted for protection and deliverance from the enemy. In fact, that's his whole, it's very easy to misunderstood. The 40 days of Lent is kind of to mirror Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, and he fasted. And it's easy to think, well, to misunderstand it and think, did the devil tempt Jesus because he was at his weakest because he was fasting? It's almost like he wanted to get him while he was down. No, it's the exact opposite way round. He was tested by the devil, so Jesus fasted in order to draw close to the Father so that he would be able to have spiritual protection. It wasn't so much that the devil tested Jesus because he was fasting, but that Jesus fasted because he was being tested by the devil. So fasting for all these kinds of different reasons. But the ultimate reason to fast is not so much for health or for guidance or for protection of the Lord, but the key word here in verse 18, the ultimate motivation, says Jesus in verse 18, the key word is this word reward. Your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. So Jesus doesn't want to guilt trip anybody into fasting. Jesus wants to inspire us to fast for the reward of the Father, for more of him, for more of his presence, for more of his goodness and blessing, for more intimacy and experience of the Father. People down the ages have fasted because they are hungry for God. That's the title of another great book on fasting by John Piper. Hungry for God. Jesus says earlier on in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And the ancients knew that the appetites, the physical and the spiritual, were all bound up together. Very difficult to be expectant and hungry for God with a full stomach. And there's something about saying no to those things which claim to satisfy us, but which don't truly, in order to go deeper into the pursuit of the one who alone can truly satisfy us. So Christians fast because we want more of him. I love the way that Richard Foster puts it. In experiences of fasting, we're not so much abstaining from food as we are feasting on God. Fasting is feasting. He says, in reference to this bit in Matthew chapter 6, where he says, if you're fasting, don't go around looking glum. Put oil on your face so it won't be others, that you're fasting. Don't disfigure your face. He says, we're told not to act miserable when fasting, because in point of fact, we are not miserable. We're feasting on God. So if you're fasting and you're drawing close to him, that's for the reward of the Father, for deeper intimacy, deeper joy, deeper encounter, deeper knowledge of his presence, deeper clarity in his word, more filling with his Spirit. The reward of the Father. Is that what we're hungry for? Well, finally, if we want to give it a go, there's still, as I say, half of Lent left. What if we're thinking, I've never done this before, but maybe I'll try? With the caveat, as somebody pointed out to me after the first service, that if, for medical reasons, it's inadvisable for you to go without food, obviously, then seek medical advice. But if you're thinking, wow, okay, I want more of God in my life. I want a deeper experience of him. What can I do? Well, Richard Foster says in his book, I think this is rather lovely and quite quaint, but definitely true, contemporary men and women are largely ignorant of the practical aspects of fasting. Those who desire to fast need to acquaint themselves with this basic information. I mean, in one sense, you think, well, how hard can it be? Just don't eat. But if we're thinking, well, I'd like to fast, but I don't really know how am I going to go about it? What he encourages is to attempt to get into a discipline whereby you fast once a week. It's no good having just a one-off. There's no point just going to the gym once, is there? Anybody who's physically fit will say, you don't just go to the gym once, you need to get into a discipline, a rhythm, a habit, a practice. And so he suggests that the discipline to aim for is fasting once a week. And perhaps just have a go at being deliberate about one particular meal which you're going to abstain from in order to deliberately focus on him. Traditionally, Friday is the day when Christians have fasted because that's the day of our Lord's crucifixion, but there may be a different day that works for you. So maybe have a go at weekly not having one meal and then working your way up to a 24-hour fast every week. So that might be lunchtime to lunchtime. In other words, don't eat dinner and then don't eat breakfast. Or it might be dinner to dinner, in which case don't eat breakfast and lunch, whatever works for you. Have a go at that. And then he says, in the beginning, attempt this once a week for several weeks. In the beginning, you'll be fascinated with the physical aspects of your experience. But the most important thing to monitor is the inner attitude of your heart. Outwardly, you'll be performing the regular duties of your day, but inwardly you'll be in prayer and adoration, song and worship. You'll probably feel some hunger pangs or discomfort before the time is up. I find this really helpful. If you've never done this before, you're going, oh no, what's happening? He says, this is not real hunger. It's a bit like when Fred comes and says, I'm starving. No, you're not. He says, this is not real hunger. Your stomach has been trained through years of conditioning to give signals of hunger at certain times. In many ways, the stomach is like a spoiled child and doesn't need indulgence but discipline. You must not give in to this grumbling. Ignore it. In a brief time, it will pass. If not, sip another glass of water and the stomach will be satisfied. But he says you're to be the master of your stomach and not its slave. What a healthy discipline to try and get into. He goes on to say, although the physical aspects of fasting intrigue us, we must never forget that the major work of scriptural fasting is in the realm of the spirit. What goes on spiritually is much more important than what is happening bodily. Fasting can bring breakthroughs in the spiritual realm that will never happen any other way. It is a means of God's grace, and blessing that should not be neglected any longer. What do you think? I bet there's quite a lot of us here who have never thought about this, who've never ever fasted, who've certainly never thought about it for as long as whatever that was, 20 minutes, and didn't realize that Jesus actually said his disciples will fast, and this actually might be for your benefit and good for you. There's still half of Lent to go. What about giving it a try? Shall we stand? And why don't we just respond in prayer?